Listen to a conversation between a student and his psychology professor.
Good afternoon, Alex. Can I help you with something?
Well, I wanted to talk with you about the research project you assigned today. I hoped you could clarify a few things for me.
Well, I'll certainly try.
Okay, all we have to do is do 2 observations and take notes on them, right?
Oh, that's a start, but you'll need to do some research, too. Then you'll write a paper that's not so much about the observations, but a synthesis of what you've observed and read.
Okay, and what about the children I'm supposed to observe?
Not children. A single child observed twice.
Oh, okay. So I should choose a child, with the permission of the child's parent, of course, and then observe that child a couple of times and take good notes? Then?
Actually, after your first observation, you'll go back and look through your textbook or go to the library and find a few sources concerning the stage of development this particular child is in. And then, with that knowledge, you'll make a second observation of the same child to see if the expected developmental behaviors are exhibited.
Can you give me an example?
Well, if you observed a 4-year-old child, for example, my daughter is 4 years old, you might read up on Piaget's stages of cognitive development. We covered those in class.
Uh-huh.
And most likely, what stage would a child of that age be in?
The pre-operational stage?
Exactly. If that's the case, her language use would be maturing, and her memory and imagination would be developed.
So she might play pretend. Like she can pretend when driving her toy car across the couch that the couch is actually a bridge or something.
That's right. In addition, her thinking would be primarily egocentric.
So she'd be thinking mostly about herself and her own needs, and might not be able to see things from anyone else's perspective?
Mm-hmm.
But what if she doesn't? I mean, what if she doesn't demonstrate those behaviors?
Well, that's fine. You'll note that in your paper. See, your paper should compare what is expected of children at certain stages of development with what you actually observe.
Okay. I have one more question, though.
And what's that?
Where can I find a child to observe?
I'd suggest you contact the Education Department secretary. She has a list of contacts at various schools and with certain families who are somehow connected to the university. Sometimes they're willing to help out students with projects like yours.
Okay. I'll stop by the Education Department office this afternoon.
And if you have any trouble or any more questions, feel free to come by during my office hours.
Listen again to part of the conversation. Then answer the question.
Okay. All we have to do is do 2 observations and take notes on them, right?
Oh, that's a start.
What does the professor mean when she says this?
Oh, that's a start.
Listen to part of a lecture in a city planning class.
In the last 50 years or so, many American cities have had difficulty in maintaining a successful retail environment. Business owners in the city centers, or the downtown areas, have experienced some financial losses because of a steady movement of people out of the cities and into the suburbs. In general, downtown areas just don't have that many residential areas. Not that many people live there. So, what if city planners decided to do about it? Well, one way they've come up with some ways to attract more people to shop downtown was by creating pedestrian malls. Now, what is a pedestrian mall? It's a pretty simple concept, really. It's essentially an outdoor shopping area designed just for people on foot. And, unlike many other shopping malls that are built in the suburbs nowadays, these pedestrian malls are typically located in the downtown area of the city. And they have features like wide sidewalks, comfortable outdoor seating, and maybe even fountains and, art. There are variations on this model, of course, but the common denominator is always the idea of creating a shopping space that will get people to shop in the city without needing their cars. So I'm sure you can see how having an area that's off limits to automobile traffic would be ideal for a heavily populated city where, the streets would otherwise be bustling with noisy, unpleasant traffic congestion. Now, the concept, which originated in Europe, was adopted by American city planners in the late 1950s, and since then, a number of United States cities have created pedestrian malls, and many of them have been highly successful. So, what have city planners learned about making these malls succeed? Well, there are two critical factors to consider when creating a pedestrian mall: location and design, both of which are equally important. Now let's start with the location. In choosing a specific location for a pedestrian mall, there are, in fact, two considerations: proximity to potential customers, that's what we would call a customer base, and accessibility to public transportation, which we'll get to in just a moment. Now, for a customer base, the most obvious example would be a large office building, since the employees could theoretically go shopping after work or during their lunch hour, right? Another really good example is a convention center, which typically has a hotel and large meeting spaces to draw visitors to the city for major business conferences and events. But ideally, the pedestrian mall would be used by local residents, not just people working in the city or visiting the area. So that's where access to public transportation comes in. Either the designers plan to locate the mall near a central transportation hub, like a bus terminal, a major train or subway station, or they work with city officials to create sufficient parking areas not too far from the mall. Which makes sense, because if people can't drive into the mall area, well, then they need to have easy access to it. Okay, so that's location. But what about design? Well, design doesn't necessarily include things like sculptures or decorative walkways or even eye-catching window displays, art. Although I'd be the first to admit those things are aesthetically appealing. However, visually pleasing sites, well, they're not a part of the pedestrian mall design that matter the most. The key consideration is a compact and convenient layout, one which allows pedestrians to walk from one end of the mall to the other in just a few minutes, so they can get to the major stores, restaurants, and other central places without having to take more than one or two turns. Now, this takes careful and creative planning. But now, what if one ingredient to this planning recipe is missing? There could quite possibly be long-lasting effects. And I think a good example is the pedestrian mall in Louisville, Kentucky, for instance. Now, when the Louisville Mall was built, it had lots of visual appeal. It was attractively designed, right in a small part of downtown, and it pretty much possessed all of the other design elements for success. But now here's where my point about location comes into play. There wasn't a convention center around to help draw in visitors, and, the only nearby hotel eventually closed down for that same reason. Well, you can imagine how this must have affected local and pedestrian mall business owners, sort of what we call a chain reaction. It wasn't until a convention center and a parking garage were built about a decade later that the mall started to be successful.
What does the professor mean when she says this?
Well, design doesn't necessarily include things like sculptures or decorative walkways or even eye-catching window displays, art. Although I'd be the first to admit those things are aesthetically appealing.
Listen to part of a lecture in an ecology class.
So, continuing our discussion of ecological systems, whole systems, the main thing to keep in mind here is the interrelationships. The species in a system, and even the landscape itself, they're interdependent. Let's take what you read for this week and see if we can't apply this interdependence idea. Mike?
Well, how about beavers? Ecosystems with beavers and waterways.
Good. Go on.
Well, you can see how it's so important because if you go back before Europeans settled in North America, like before the 1600s, back when Native Americans were the only people living here, well, back then there were a lot of beavers. But later on, after Europeans...
Okay, wait. I see where you're heading with this, but before we go into how European settlement affected the ecosystem, tell me this. What kind of environment do beavers live in? Think about what it was like before the European settlers came. We'll come back to where you were headed.
Okay, well, beavers live near streams and rivers, and they block up the streams and rivers with logs and sticks and mud. You know, they build dams that really slow down the flow of the stream. So then the water backs up and creates like a pond that floods the nearby land.
And that creates wetlands. Okay, tell me more.
Well, with wetlands, it's like there's more standing water, more still water around. And that water is a lot cleaner than swiftly flowing water because the dirt and sediment and stuff has a chance to sink to the bottom.
More important for our discussion, wetland areas support a lot more varieties of life than swiftly flowing water. For example, there are more varieties of fish, of insects, lots of frog species. And then species that rely on those species start to live near the wetlands too.
Yes, like birds and mammals that eat the fish and insects. And you get trees and plants that begin to grow near the standing water that can't grow near running water. Oh, and there's something about wetlands and groundwater, too.
Okay, good. Wetlands have a big effect on groundwater, the amount of water below the surface of the land. Think of wetlands as, like a giant sponge. The earth soaks up a lot of this water that's continually flooding the surface, which increases the amount of water below. So where there are wetlands, you get a lot of groundwater. And groundwater happens to be a big source of our own drinking water today. All right, so back to the beavers. What if the beavers weren't there?
You'd just have a regular running stream because there's no dam. So the ecosystem would be completely different. There'd be fewer wetlands.
Exactly. So now let's go back to where you were headed before, Mike. You mentioned a change that occurred after Europeans came to North America.
Yeah. Well, there used to be beavers all over the place, something like 200 million beavers just in the continental United States. But when Europeans came, they started hunting the beavers for their fur, because beaver fur, it's really warm, and it was really popular for making hats in Europe. So the beavers were hunted a lot, overhunted. They were almost extinct by the 1800s, so that meant fewer wetlands, less standing water.
And what does that mean for the ecosystem? Kate?
Well, if there's less standing water, then the ecosystem can't support as many species, because a lot of insects and fish and frogs can't live in running water, and then the birds and animals that eat them lose their food supply.
Precisely. So the beaver in this ecosystem is what we call a keystone species. The term keystone kind of explains itself. In architecture, a keystone in an archway or doorway is the stone that holds the whole thing together and keeps it from collapsing. Well, that's what a keystone species does in an ecosystem. It's the crucial species that keeps the system going. Now, beaver populations are on the rise again, but there's something to think about. Consider humans as part of these ecosystems. You've probably heard about water shortages or restrictions on how much water you can use, especially in the summertime in recent years. And remember what I said about groundwater. Imagine if we still had all those beavers around, all those wetlands. What would our water supply be like then?
Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
So the beaver in this ecosystem is what we call a keystone species. The term keystone kind of explains itself. In architecture, a keystone in an archway or doorway is the stone that holds the whole thing together and keeps it from collapsing.
Why does the professor say this?
The term keystone kind of explains itself. In architecture, a keystone in an archway or doorway is the stone that holds the whole thing together and keeps it from collapsing.
What does the professor imply when she says this?
Imagine if we still had all those beavers around, all those wetlands. What would our water supply be like then?